So we've sort of introduced this idea, or you guys have rediscovered this idea several times over the past 2 days, that often you want to do something like an API call or interact with the data in a certain way that makes it easier to express some heuristic, right? And so certainly for the text domain, you could imagine a bunch of helper type functions that can make certain operations easier. And basically all these are abstractions over what you are attempting to supervise, right? What you're attempting to write labeling functions for. So you can think of them again as this API type of thing. In text, it'll be some of the functions we'll talk about in a moment. In images, it might be some of the stuff that Paroma spoke about this morning, where you run like Google object detection to create named bounding boxes in a picture. These are all just sort of abstractions and layers of other, often machine learning models that we can utilize in some way to write more abstract, more human interpretable labeling functions. And you can think of this, if you're familiar from the machine learning side of the world, as a form of transfer learning. And it's sort of taking the inductive bias or the effort to build one representation of knowledge, i.e. the effort to encode and train a model, and lifting it up and using it for a purpose, maybe not directly for what it was intended. And that's sort of, you want to transfer the effort from one problem to another in sort of a low-cost, cheap way. And that's frequently employed in a lot of machine learning pipelines. So labeling functions give us a sort of natural, easy, software system-y kind of way of approaching this concept. So if you've noticed as you've sort of walked through all of this, the mimic data for the morning, you'll see that a lot of patterns show up time and time and time again. Disorders are frequently negated. There's frequently things like historical mentions of things. Condition maybe, presented as hypothetical. All of these bits of information may live under specific headers. Is this history of present illness? Is this family history, right? These all tell you little bits of clues about, the types of information you want to extract and who it applies to. And then super useful often to know what other types of concepts are being talked about. So if you have something like the UMLS, you would like to be able to take all of these concepts in text and map them back to some representation so that you can more easily interact and test things. Just some concrete examples from my device surveillance example. We had formulated that problem as identifying any present positive indication of a post-surgical implant complication. That might be something like an implant failing, it might be something like an implant breaking, or more longer term, like parts of the liner wearing or bone loss change, all of these things that could happen. So we specifically counted any mention of these three types as a false, right? So in that setting, these types of labeling functions were immensely helpful as ways to make it very easy to identify false cases by just invoking a helper function. Similarly, if you want to get rid of historical mentions, things like history of present illness or indications, these are all clues about sections mean a lot, certainly in clinical notes. For scientific literature, which a lot of people are looking at, we had another project where, is my piece of software being used in this paper? Or is it just being cited as background literature? So if I show up in the methods section versus perhaps the introduction or something, or the discussion, that's a weak signal that maybe this software is actually being used in purpose of this paper. So there's all types of things that you'd like just to be able to, really pull off the shelf and use immediately. Basically, everything that we wrote, and this is just to make it more concrete, this is maybe how you would think about breaking apart a labeling function in clinical text, assuming you had a really nice API. Maybe you want to validate the entities are correct, you check with the tagger or something, check if it says a certain location in the document, and then all the other stuff we just talked about, and then you want to layer a few domain-specific heuristics. You can imagine this recipe living on top of any application in some sense. Not super like a sophisticated idea, just a pretty intuitive sort of way to approach these labeling function ideas. Oh, also I wanted to show, so this was Paroma mentioned some of the visualization stuff. This is some of like the preliminary t-SNE-based visualization tools for entities that is being cooked up, eventually be released somewhere.